Chapter 60, 5 Against 1. 5 Against 1. Frithia kept her breathing light, not wishing to disturb the arm that encircled her waist as the world beyond the closed shutters lightened with the sunrise. She had been awake for a while now. Cellophane laid just beside her and she could feel the warmth his skin radiated across the few inches between them. It was no different from how she had greeted many mornings since they had set out together from Suldanessellar, outside of the naked closeness of their bodies. They were in the room Imoen had once shared with Valigar. Where the ranger and Inomen had spent the night, Frithia was not sure. Cellophane had seen to the details. Her stomach squirmed in memory of the feeling, part desire, part nervousness as he had left her with a kiss at the door upon the darkened landing, the sound of the others' discussion still rumbling in the kitchen downstairs. She did not know how he had broached it, but she felt no shame. Love was a bold emotion, brave and honest. He had not been away for long, but the waiting had been agony all the same. Seated on the end of the bed in the light of a single lamp, her heart trembling like frightened a bird with only her sandals removed, not because she was shy to disrobe, but because she wanted him to do it. To feel his hands and mouth, to revel in that moment of undaunted vulnerability as the last shreds of their friendly reserve were shed, the girl cramming every sensation she should have had a lifetime to share with him into the only night they may get. And it had been wonderful. At times, it had seemed dizzyingly fast, every feeling rushing her into the next, like the current of some great ocean, and then there would come the moments that just hung, timeless, and it seemed as though every sensation was there at once. His face outlined in gold above her, the taste of his sweat, the soft words at her ear and every pulse of the body that was pressed to hers. It had been such a conflict in her at the time, Frithia torn between surrendering to the feelings as they came, or trying to focus, to cling to each and burn it into her memory, that she could relive it over and over. She was disappointed now how quickly the night had faded into an incoherent jumble of images and sensations. It made the time she had then all the more precious. She let her eyes drift over the body next to her for what felt like the 100th time. Most of Cellophane's face was obscured by the loose abundance of fine white hair, the few strands that hung across his parted lips stirring with the steady rhythm of his breathing. Above the blankets, the frail light brought out the scars that scored his shoulders and chest, her fingertips tracing along his arm, where the smooth skin was broken here and there by some furrow or pock, as though she could commit every inch to memory. Part of her wanted to wake him to enjoy the few hours they had left together before the inevitable bloodshed. But to do so would be to consign that moment, and her peaceful submergence in that feeling of loving and of being loved, forever to the past, and she hung in indecision until his roused sigh made it for her. He stretched sleepily, white eyelashes fluttering open as the arm about her tightened. Frithia greeted him with a smile and he replied in kind, Cellophane shifting to prop himself up on one elbow, the fingers he stroked down her bared shoulder leaving her with a cool shiver that he warmed with a kiss.
The poets have it right. Nor has this life in it aught better than this hour of clear coolness, the hour of waking together. Not better,
she teased, squirming closer to bask in the heat of his body.
I think last night might have been a strong contender.
A paused to consider the event once again, the smile pulling at her mouth as memories trembled through her stomach.
Is it usually like that?
The drow snorted his vehemence.
It is never like that. Well, good. I mean, if it were, how would anyone get anything done?
Cellophane laughed fondly, grey eyes alive with affection.
You took pleasure, then? Wasn't that stridently obvious?
They both laughed that time, though the sound was soon muffled as he leaned in to catch her mouth in a kiss, the light-headed warmth at last broken to leave them both pleasantly breathless. Frithia sank back into the pillow, Cellophane remaining propped up beside her, his free hand combing through the hair at her temples, while the rest was left to entwine with his upon the mattress beneath.
Such a rich amber, I never before noticed how many colors made up the whole. Look here, this strand is almost golden.
Fritha laughed, amused as she nearly went cross-eyed trying to see the fine strand of hair he was holding before her gaze.
I'll take your word for it.
She caught his hand mid-stroke, bringing it down to lightly kiss the fingertips from smallest to his thumb, which she nipped playfully, her teeth leaving a pattern of neatly paired indentations as she worked across the back of his hand. If it hurt, Cellophane did not complain, the man letting her finish to hold up his hand with an artistic detachment.
You made a leaf,
he smiled, seemingly pleased with her creativity.
Marking your lover like this, with nails and teeth, is popular with the Kalimshites. They find sensuality in the belief that one can look at them later and recall their shared passion.
Cellophane chuckled.
I need no reminders.
Fritha laughed and shifted onto her stomach, the movement stirring up the spicy, almost sour shared scent of their skin. Light fingers were tracing across her naked back, sweeping the stray curls from the pale canvas.
Have you decided what you will draw yet?
She could hear Cellophane's smile.
I will inscribe you with poems of devotion, speckle you with the stars we once gazed upon, entwine you in branches of jasmine for your scent and oak for your strength, and I will cover you in every word I should have breathed to you from the moment we first met. You will be an altar to my love. You make a fine votary.
She rolled onto her back once more, not wanting him to miss the beaming delight of her mischief.
I hope Illustré doesn't mind sharing.
He laughed, leaning down, and the world was suddenly banished by a curtain of white to leave only his face.
I will stop your mouth.
Fritha glanced to the man who had risen next to her, but kept her fingers moving over the silken strands of hair she had been weaving for the last couple of hours, the rhythm of deft knots more than familiar after a childhood of such games. Cellophane had shaded his eyes beneath a hand, the sun behind him as he gazed east beyond the walls to the camp that bustled upon the plains, easy to see from their vantage on the sheltered roof of the group's house.
What do you see?
The same, Cellophane answered, dropping once more into the cover of the wall that sheltered them both.
Balthazar's men have finally finished bringing more timber from the edge of the Apogis, they must have enough ladders by now, while those of our own company are running contingency drills upon the main field.
He had not needed to add that last part, the pair could hear them, the shouts of Valigar, Minsk, and Jahara coming clear over the dull rumble of the squads as they hurried to fortify some imaginary breach, or charge enemies at the gates.
We should join them,
Fritha fretted, but made no immediate move to rise, and Cellophane snaked an arm about her waist as though to ensure it.
They have it more than covered, it was Jahara herself who suggested we were not needed. You know, she was only saying that to be kind. So let her,
he sighed gently, and any protest she had cared to make was silenced in a light kiss. Fritha nodded as they parted and pressed on with her weaving, the nagging guilt buried under the more pressing desire to spend those last few hours with him alone. Perhaps it was something Jahara understood, how sometimes would never come again. She had certainly been the one who first mentioned it over the group's late breakfast, though Celophane's talk of the druid's suggestion had been optimistic, to Fritha it had sounded more like an order, the others about the table quietly nodding their agreement. And so they had retreated up to the roof to while away the day in talk, affection, and idle tunes from her lute, as though that world and its wars was a time and place far removed from them. In her lap, Fritha finally completed her work, the last knot tied the end of the long band of woven hair, and she removed the pin that had anchored it to her trousers with a flourish.
There, finished.
She held the flat, woven band out for him to see, a pattern of chevrons and checks in white and amber in hair. It was not the most intricate pattern she knew, but she was limited by colors and time, and Solifane seemed pleased all the same. The man was stroking his fingers back and forth, first with and then against the grain, and Frithha considered a simple friendship bracelet would have been something of an anathema to his own people.
You were right, she smiled, our tones do look well together. And thus are we bound within the tapestry of life. Yes, for now.
Solifane sighed. They had been the same all day, wavering between joy and a directionless melancholy that seemed to creep in when their guard was down.
I am sorry, I should not have.
She gave a shrug that was neither agreement nor censure.
In truth, I am more worried for you. I know I shouldn't be.
She laughed gently at his frown.
You have friends enough, and it feels like I've asked half the population of Athkatla to keep an eye on you. I just want to know you will be happy, and I suppose I'd prefer the certainty that comes with being here to ensure it. But...
Frithha sighed again and reached out to push back his sleeve and tie the bracelet about his bared forearm. For a moment, Solifane gazed down upon it in contemplative silence, the pale amber band bright against his skin.
So,
he considered, the emergent smile tugging at his lips,
are we betrothed now?
Frithha laughed so loudly it started the pigeons on the next roof over, the girl leaning in to catch his grin with a sound kiss.
Why not? No priest could bind me to you more completely than my love already has.
She pushed back her sleeve and set her bared arm alongside his, the band that encircled his wrist an uneven match to the leafy jasmine vines that coiled in henna about her forearm.
We have each bound the other,
she murmured, stroking fingers along their paired arms, their skin feeling all the smoother under her dry hands, his radiating warmth and her silken in that seemingly perpetual coolness. Solifane slipped his arm above hers to entwine their hands, his face slowly closing to her.
And none shall part us.
They kissed again, more gravely this time, there was a promise behind it. A lull seemed to fall over Al-Hali as the dusk drew in. Against the walls, each scaffold shone with an aura of gold against the darkening sky, the torches providing light for the archers that were stationed upon them. Imoen lingered in one such pool of gold by the northern wall, wishing its warmth could somehow banish the cold trepidation she felt. They had finished the drills in the late afternoon, the squads dispersing to spend an hour or so with their friends and loved ones, before they trailed back to the main field to await what was to come. In the deep grey sky above, clouds hung in palest lilac, the upper billows almost glowing with an eerie light of their own, as though the spirits of the air had gathered there to watch the fate of a land be decided. A premonition of dread shivered up Imoen's spine, it would not be long now, and she turned her attention to those upon the field about her. Come the battle, Solifane was to be stationed on the wall, where his agility could be used to best advantage, while Frithha, for her part, was much farther back, joining the guards who were to surround the small aid post which had been set up just beside the eastern barricade. A Nomen was there now, saying a last few words to the assembled clerics and volunteers, Audran and Rahila leading prayers for a small group of soldiers who had gathered about them.
You make no prayers for the coming battle, young Imoen.
Came that familiar voice and she turned, the smile already warming her eyes as she found Minsk and Jahara behind her.
It seems a bit late now, besides, if the gods gave a damn, they could have stopped this long ago.
The druid cast a contemplative frown to the sky and sighed.
I am not sure if even they could end this now, some things mortal men must decide.
Imoen gave the ranger's arm a hearty slap.
I guess it's down to us then, right Minsk? Indeed, and Bu says, the glory in this shall be ours alone. Yeah,
Imoen sighed, the weight landing heavy in her stomach as she realized this could be the last chance she had to talk to either of them.
You know, I never really said this before, but these last couple of years, even with Irenicus and the asylum, and well, I've really grown and seen stuff, and, you too, well, you're like Fritha to me now, like family, and I just wanted.
A furious embrace engulfed Imoen before the waver of her voice managed to betray her.
Foolish girl,
Jaehaera scolded wetly as they parted, Minsk nearly crushing the pair of them with a hug of his own.
Hush, young Imoen, such words need not be spoken aloud. Minsk and Bu know the bond that runs through all our hearts. I know,
nodded Imoen, swallowing the tears to force a smile.
Just take care, both of you.
From the gates, the cry came like an eagle's shriek above the murmur of the field.
There is movement from the camp, it looks like, their army is advancing.
Jaehaera leapt up the first few rungs of the watchtower ladder beside her.
All right. Squads, into your opening formations.
The milling throng was suddenly hurrying about them. Jaehaera was already racing for the gates and the scaffold tower on the northern side that was her post, Imoen reaching up to share a last embrace with Minsk before hastening to her own tower on the southern side of the gates. Back at the barricade, Fritha and Solifane were locked in a final goodbye, and Imoen watched them lean in to kiss, Solifane's hand lingering at the side of the girl's face as they parted. His lips were murmuring some pledge or prayer, Fritha reaching up to take his hand and hold it there, turning her face to place a single kiss upon the palm, and another was shared between them before they finally tore themselves apart. Others about the field were doing the same, civilians bidding farewells to those who would be in the fight before retreating back past the only open barricade into the village proper. Imoen spared a glance to Valigar on the watchtower just south along from hers, but he was not looking her way, his frown trained instead upon the twilit plains. And her eyes would join his soon enough, but first. Imoen turned to face the field of men and women below her. Jaehaera had told her a speech would be expected, and the girl had spent a couple of hours that afternoon trying to make notes. As one, the amassed force seemed to shift their attention, the girl all at once the sole focus of their gaze. The charged silence was deafening. Imoen drew a breath and forced the tremor from her voice.
People of Tethur, allies.
Across the field, her eyes caught on a familiar blot of amber hair, the word came choked in the surge of emotion.
Friends. I understand when we first gathered here, it was in the belief it would be us on the march, taking the fight east. But however we are to face our enemy, I know we will do so with bravery, unity and.
Imoen's mind went blank. Her words were hollow, below her people were being to shift and murmur. An instant to feel that swelling doubt, and Imoen threw her hands up.
Oh, bollocks to it. Truth is, I'm not some war hero who can pull a rousing speech out of her arse at a moment's notice. I'm just like you. And I'm here because Balthazar is a coward who sends merc bands to drive people from their homes. I'm here because he'd butcher an entire town to see it purged. I'm here because if someone doesn't stop him now, he will have slaughter from here to Castle Tethur before any could halt him. That's why I'm here, and that's why you're here, and that's why we're going to win.
Their roar hit her like shockwave. In the distance, Imoen could see Fritha grinning, the girl throwing a fist in the air in her ferocious delight. Solifane's shout brought an abrupt end to their elation.
To the east, they're closing.
Imoen whipped back to see the grouped figures approaching across the darkened plains, and as they closed, she could make out the ladders they carried. She counted 8 in all, a score or so of men clustered about each and racing from the gloom, the majority heading for the wall either side of the gate. A glance to Jaehaera, the druid nodded once and raised an arm.
Archers.
The creaking whisper as 24 bows were drawn back and held fast, awaiting the signal. On the scaffold along the wall from Imoen's, Valigar readied a crossbow. For an instant, the village held its breath. Jaehaera swept down her hand.
Fire!
In the darkness of the plains, cries shrieked and shapes fell to the grass. A yell went up from those left, their pace doubled for the last stretch and no time was given for another volley. One by one, the ladders hit the wall, mercenaries scrambling up to throw over the stout logs that had been tied to the topmost rungs and anchor them there, while on the plains beneath, men planted their shields to provide cover for those waiting to ascend. Jahara remained unfazed, her arm raised once more as she bellowed the command.
Torches!
On the scaffolds, archers scrambled forward to take up their lights, and, for an instant, the village was plunged into a well of darkness, only to rise once more in the surge of a blazing dawn as fire roared up from the trench below. A cacophony of screams echoed across the night as smoke billowed up to score throats and choke ally and enemy alike. 2 of the ladders were on fire, but the mercenaries were persevering, some managing to kick the disturbed earth of the trench over to smother the flames, others dragging the burning debris clear with mailed hands. Valigar ducked below the shelter of the wall to reload his crossbow, eyes stinging. A ladder had been planted a few paces along the wall from his scaffold. A dark shape appeared from the billowing smoke and Valigar hadn't the time to yell his warning as a familiar click released a bolt into the archer crouched on the next scaffold along. The ranger fumbled over his crossbow in his haste, the mercenary was already over the wall and setting up position on the watchtower he had taken.
Solafane!
The drow's head darted back at the shout, a gesture to the tower sending the man into action, and Solafane was on the wall itself and racing through the hail of arrows to surprise the merc with a stab to the back. A sword sweep freed the nearby ladder from its anchor and another kick sent the frame falling into the fires below, the drow almost following it as an arrow thudded into his shoulder. It bit through his armor to score his arm, but the cut was not deep. He snapped it off and carried on, dropping into the cover of the scaffold to find his next target. But the mercenaries were surging up the ladders in too great a number to stop completely. Enemy archers were on the other side of the walls keeping the allied forces from pressing in to deal with them as mercs dropped over and quickly grouped to get a foothold. A number of them were amassing beneath a ladder to the southeast, the mercenaries using a tight formation of shields. Imoen felt her magics building.
Fall back!
She screamed, and her allies hastened back as a fireball scattered those mercenaries not fortunate enough to dodge it, the men running panicked to meet the blades of the surrounding troops. Fritha hustled back to make room for the man being stretchered past her, his writhing body so covered in blood and wounds she could not tell from which gaping injury he was dying. Behind her, volunteers were running back and forth with water and bundles of torn sheeting. A no-man was shouting for more bandages, Audrin beside him and chanting a prayer over some sweating soldier's leg wound, the man still gripping his sword as though he would be charging out to rejoin his squad as soon as he was able. They were using a system of triage. Those who could be, quickly patched up and sent back out to the fight. Those who were in a more critical condition were stabilized and then stretchered past the still open barricade to the larger aid camp Fritha knew had been set up in Main Square, where Benita and the other clerics fought, up to their elbows in blood, to save what lives they could. Closer to the open side of the barricade, Rahila made last adjustments to the wadding she had packed into the stomach wound of the man on the stretcher before her, her matronly tones giving the two who bore it strict instructions of how to describe the wound to Brother Deepak once they reached him. Fritha turned away as Rahila wiped the sweat from her beleaguered brow and bustled on to the next patient. There was nothing more she could do to help them any better than the peasants they had recruited, and Fritha returned her attentions to the fighting on the field before her, her body part of a wall of warriors which stood guard against the carnage. At the northern wall, a group of mercs had gained a foothold and were refusing to be routed. Minsk took command of the field before them.
Sarsen, Baldur, advance your men from either side and prevent retreat. Those with me, charge!
But a smaller group of mercs had already broken away, skirting along the wall to the gates for reinforcements. Jahara spotted them from her vantage on the scaffold above.
Brevik, Hahani, hold the gates!
She screamed to the nearest two squad leaders, leaping down to aid the fight, and that was the only thing that saved her as a missile plummeted from the darkness above to smash into the wall where she had just been standing. Jahara whipped back to the girl still on her watchtower on the other side of the gates.
Imoen!
But Imoen had already spotted them as the iridescent glow highlighted three figures on the distant plains, their protection magics swirling about them like a swarm of pale blue fireflies. Balthazar had mages. Imoen raised her hands, the powers building to be released in an arc of energy that crackled across the plains in a lightning strike. Her dismay choked like her spell as one of the mages threw a green dome over their trio. All the while, the figure beside him had been drawing back his arms finally to throw the energies out with a cannon's flash, and Imoen dropped behind the scaffold just in time.
Get down!
Even at Fritha's vantage outside the chaos of dust and smoke, it was hard to see what was happening. Another explosion rocked the walls, Jahara's shout just audible over the roar.
The walls are breached, all troops assemble!
From somewhere in Al-Hali behind them, an arrow streaked forth and the druid dropped from sight.
Jahara!
Fritha whipped around. On a rooftop to the south, two mercenary archers had scaled a building and found a vantage. Fritha snapped her attention to the two soldiers nearest to her.
Rahl, Trent, get up there and take out those archers. I'll. What's going on?
Demanded a noman behind her.
Jahara's down, I need to.
The hand gripped about her arm removed the need for her to yell the rest of her explanation back to him.
Fritha, you must remain back here. Jahara's hurt. I will not just stand by.
Audran stepped between their escalating tempers, as gravely stoic as ever he was.
I will go.
A noman nodded, gesturing to the soldiers just behind him.
Very well. You two, go with him.
Without another word, the three hurried into the chaos. Upon the field, the dust was clearing to reveal a massive breach in the northeast section of the walls. Soldiers were running in all directions, their drills forgotten in the panic, and the mercenaries poured through unchecked, arrows from the buildings behind them doing little to stem the tide. In the chaos, that huge frame rose with blade aloft, a golden effigy of Tempest himself in the firelight, Minsk's bellow echoing over the clash about them.
For glory!
He took out two men with a single swing, blood arcing into the sky to fall like rose petals upon the conquering lord. Allies were beginning to rally about him, falling into formations to hold the breach. Upon the walls, Valigar and Solafane held the east and south, ensuring this catastrophe did not serve as distraction, and coordinating the troops to hold back the mercs that still fought to scale their defenses. Imoen was crouched behind a wall of shields beside the gates and gathering the power for another spell, and yet for all their determination, it all seemed for naught, the last burst of thrashing from a drowning man. From the east barricade, Captain Aaron had just stepped, the tall, dark-skinned soldier striding easily through the confusion of the aid post to share a few murmured words with a noman. The pair nodded, turning as one to close to her side, and she already knew what a noman was to say.
Fritha.
But, she choked, unable to give voice to the defeat that now seemed inevitable. A noman nodded, a hand landing upon her shoulder both to console and usher her before him in a single gesture.
I know, but we make it all for nothing, if we do not get you out alive. After we are safely away, they will signal the retreat to the Apogis. We can return here with reinforcements, Fritha, a whole army if needed, but we have to leave now.
Behind them, two men charged past, Jahara bloody but breathing on the stretcher they carried. There was no sign of Audran. Rahila was already descending to order the pair on past the barricades. Frithha watched Jahara go with wide eyes.
"My lady,"
pressed Captain Aaron. A roar from the field behind cut him off. The squad within the breach were being overwhelmed. Minsk was still at their heart, but he was flagging, his body stooped and heaving like a wounded bear. Mercenaries were pressing about him, a mighty cleave felling one, another two shaken off to be skewered where they fell before. At last, he disappeared under a surging tide of men. Someone was screaming for reinforcements to hold the breach. Frithha swallowed and nodded, turning from the carnage before she changed her mind.
"Let's go."
Behind the barricades, the village was deserted, and they hurried along the empty streets and past the muted disorder of the aid camp in the central square to take the main street north. It was eerie to hear the sound of a battle so close, yet to see no sign of it. Frithha's heart was beating a manic tattoo in her throat, and the fear for her friends and her love coupled with her shame at deserting them ebbed as the seed of anger bloomed in her heart. A ladder had been placed ready at the northwest section of the wall, a group of 6 riders waiting on the plains directly below with 3 spare horses. A Noman helped her onto the bay gelding that was being held for her, before easily swinging himself into the saddle of his own horse. With the battle hushed behind them, and in the clear darkness of the plains, things seemed clearer. Frithha felt her horse shifting under her, her gaze coming to focus on the swimming torchlight of the distant camp. Aaron was already mounted and barking his orders to the assembled company.
"Men, diamond configuration with the lady in the center, we ride for Lord Farn's encampment."
"No," came her voice, immovable as the mountains. The captain looked confused, a Noman looked worried.
"You wish to meet with the chalice then, my lady?" "No,"
Frithha repeated, raising a hand to the lights that peppered black horizon.
"We ride there. Their camp will be all but deserted. We will kill Balthazar while we have the chance."
A Noman looked furious.
"Frithha, that was not what was agreed. You need to remain alive until..." "Until when? This cannot end until one of us is dead. If we retreat now, how many other towns will share Al-Hali's fate before he is stopped? This ends now."
A Noman said nothing, Frithha defiant to his silence as she raised her chin to add,
"You know the fates, a Noman, you know nothing else will satisfy."
The cleric drew back, his gaze raking over every inch of her face to answer her in a nod.
"Captain Aaron."
The captain grinned, his mount pawing restlessly as he turned to his men.
"Right, you heard the lady. Standard arrow formation, keep together. Chahel."
He nodded to a burly warrior on a stout war horse.
"You will serve as the point. For Tether."
They wheeled their horses about, the beasts springing to a gallop, and they were off, charging across the darkness of the plains. Frithha kept low in her saddle, wind howling at her ears and heart thundering in time to the hooves of the horse beneath her. She pictured Balthazar there, watching the distant fires with the warm satisfaction of victory as those few left in his company milled about in unwary ignorance. And her imagination did not outstrip the reality as their charge sprang from night into the torchlight of the waiting camp and chaos erupted. People were screaming, camp followers and the other civilians who had remained behind fleeing in all directions as they charged through trampling tents and scattering cooking fires. A half-dozen monks had dashed from a nearby pavilion, Balthazar behind them and shouting his orders as the two groups clashed.
"Dismount them! Break their char!"
He stopped as through the tumult he saw her, Frithha's jolt of recognition matched by his surprise, his initially slack expression tightening to a determined frown. A pause to mark her horse, and Balthazar sprang into a run. Frithha urged the beast after him, though the creature was hampered in its pursuit by tents and fire pits alike. The man was racing out into the plains, leaving the skirmish of the camp and their allies behind them, and, for a moment, it seemed as though she would chase him down and trample him as he fled, when suddenly he halted, whipping about and with a leap drove a punch into the ground at his feet. The shock wave startled her mount and it reared in its fright. Frithha scrabbled from the saddle an instant before the creature bolted, and there they stood facing each other in the darkened plains, Alhali burning in the distant west, ringed in fire and echoing with screams as though the village itself had been summoned from some hellish realm. Balthazar threw a hand to the inferno with a self-satisfied sneer.
So, you sacrificed your entire army just to kill me, how far you have fallen in your quest for the throne?
Frithha sighed and shook her head.
No. They sacrificed themselves to save me, it had been their plan all along.
She smiled, slight and predatory.
I changed it. You should have heeded it,
he snapped.
You are a fool to force this confrontation.
Frithha trilled a laugh that was half bravado, half genuine disbelief.
I would be a fool not to. You don't know how this goes, do you? They need to see it, it needs to be direct. You've never faced one of the 5 before, those ones on whom the fates have turned their unwelcome interest. But I have. I took the enchantment from Yaga's heart. I taunted Abizagal into the battle that would be his death. I stood and watched while Sendai writhed in glass and poison.
She adjusted the grip on her hilt, the essence roared.
And now, I will end you.
A leap closed the distance between them enough for her sword thrust to have skewered him had the man still been there, and his fist caught her square between the shoulders. Frithha whipped around, just blocking the blow to her face with her forearm, and he danced out of reach before her blade could even complete its swing. The man passed her guard once more to throw a kick to her left flank. He was fast, his body reacting seemingly without a thought to dodge her swings and find an opening of his own, and Frithha's frustrations grew by the second. Each blow hurt, but did little more than that through her chainmail and jack. He was trying to wear her down, waiting for her to tire and make a mistake that would leave her open, but his smug patience as Alhali burned merely fueled her anger. A wild thrust towards his chest, Balthazar stepping past the blade to hook a hand about her belt, and it was all she could do to keep hold of her sword as she was thrown to the earth. He was already airborne and plummeting towards her, his bent knee the focus of his descent. Frithha rolled clear just in time, the ground where he had landed quaking with the blow, and the explosion of dust hid the strike as she rolled to her feet to slash him across the shoulder. Balthazar leapt back, putting a wary distance between them once more, as Frithha's challenge echoed across the plains.
Come on, then!
She screamed, a hand flung to the fiery carnage in the distance beside them.
You wanted this, bastard! So come and take it!
The twitch to his nostrils was the only betrayal of his anger. Fists pummeled toward her from every angle in a blur of motion, and it was all she could do to keep him back, her sword swinging in wide powerful arcs. He had speed, but she only needed one good hit. It was tiring though, Balthazar's chest heaving in unison with her own as they circled each other once more. Something had to give. The moment hung as he paused on the edge of her reach, and suddenly he was rushing her. She swung out to meet the advance when at the last instant he skidded under the sweeping blade in her guard, his uppercut catching her neatly in the sternum. It seemed to vibrate through her chain mail, the force of the blow knocking her back to send wild palpitations through her heart. Frithha clutched at her chest, gasping for breath as she stumbled backwards. Balthazar was panting, face set and eyes bright as he bounced on the balls of his feet and readied his final blow. His leg whipped up, the heel cracking down into her forearm to cast her sword skittering useless into the dust. His fist was already pulled back, his strike unprepared for the sudden shift in her stance. Her lunge caught him square in the stomach. He tried to throw her past him, her fingers clawing at his robes as they met, and they both hit the dirt with a shared cry. A frantic scramble, Balthazar was fighting to get her off as Fritha hooked her leg about his torso and rolled on top of him. Her hands found their way about his neck, and, in the desperation to shift her, he mirrored the movement, rough fingers closing over her throat. Fritha fought the wild surge of animal panic and tightened her grip. He had strength, but she had hatred, and after 2 years of hell, she knew which was stronger. Her throat was on fire, blackness creeping into her vision as stars fizzed before her eyes, and in flashes, the images came, a jagged red wasteland beneath a sky of boiling green, twisted demons and their tortured thralls, and there, clear and pale as an ivory tusk, an osseous pillar that split land and sky, the throne of bone. There was a burning wetness to her neck, his fingernails so short it was his fingertips that had gouged the thick welts about her throat. But his grip was failing, the bulging eyes fluttering closed, and in that instant she saw his end. She drew back a hand, the other snatched away at the last instant before the blow smashed into his throat. A final wretched wheeze, his dark eyes snapping open for that instant of terrified disbelief, and Balthazar breathed no more. All the strength seemed to leave her arms, and Fritha collapsed sideways to lie panting in the dust beside him. The sparse grass blades trembled with each ragged breath, tickling her cheek, while arcing from horizon to horizon was that all-consuming blackness, the stars hiding their gaze behind a veil of smoke as though they did not wish to look down upon the horrors of men. Through the ground, the rumbled approach of horses, a no-man's voice strangled in his fears.
"Fritha! Leave me here,"
she croaked, giving what little volume she could to the order.
"Return to Al-Hali and take the news, Balthazar is dead."
Feet were thudding to the ground about her, strong arms heaving her under the arms and legs in a confusion of shouts as the men tried to coordinate the lift. Someone was reaching out to take her, and she was upright and nestled against a cool steel pall drawn before she opened her eyes. She was seated before a no-man in the saddle of his horse, his worried face haloed by the starless void above as his hands groped down her arms and torso, checking for injury.
"Fritha, are you hurt?" "A no-man,"
she gasped, the words burning in her throat.
"I saw it. I saw the throne."
And the night sky came down and swallowed her up. Fritha opened her eyes to the vast viridian tempest that hung above her tiled plain. Not again, not when Al-Hali burned and her friend fought to their last. Her limbs were trembling, body twitching with the desire to scream her rage at the glary storm, when a sudden shadow spared her eyes.
"Sister,"
came the sigh, weary with the rasp of last year's leaves.
"Thanks be, I did not know if even your powers could pull me out a second time." "Saravik!"
Fritha grasped the hand he offered to be hauled to her feet.
"Where in the hells have you been? I've not seen you for days."
He tried a chuckle, the man wincing with the tremble of his chest, and it was only then she noticed his hunched stance. His lined skin was pale and sagging upon a frame much frilier than she recalled, as though there was another 10 years between them. He suffered no injury she could see, but the aura of ruin about him was unmistakable. He looked broken. A ghost of a smile twisted his chapped lips.
"You are closer to the truth than you think, sister. I may not have long. Balthazar is dead, yes? His death was bound to bring you here, and that means only Melisande is left. Saravik, I need to wake. I have to." "Just listen,"
he cut in, his eyes the only part of him left with any spark of verve.
"They will be searching for me even now. You must reach the plane of yawning pits, the first level of the abyss. She awaits you there." "Who?" "The Balite cleric, Elund."
Fritha could barely voice the name in her surprise.
"Brianna? But she's dead, yes. I thought of the young cleric you killed when I spoke of getting a priest of Baal to summon a petitioner as a guide to the throne. There are no priests to him remaining, at least not within your reach, but I knew there could be one petitioner. Before, all those who died in his faith will have renounced Val in favor of Sirik or another, or been condemned to the wall. The wall.
Fritha repeated. Saravuk spared her an impatient sigh.
The wall of the faithless, all godless souls are sent there. But with the death of the Balspawn and Bal's realm slowly coalescing, I knew there could be a chance. I found her wandering a Zagrat. Her spirit is a native to the hells now and can travel the layers without notice.
Fritha drew back. The enormity of what this man, her brother, she had believed, in name only, had done.
You returned to the abyss.
He nodded once, the decisive jolt made him grimace.
Yes, my only chance rests upon you taking the throne, and...
He turned away, the deep lines in his face twisting with an expression of disgust. Contrition? She was not sure.
You were right, sister, I was afraid. I made decisions in my life and damned the consequences, but when I came to realize the true cost of my actions, I tried to flee, to hide in your shadow like some craven dog. The hells do not take kindly to those seeking to avoid the just rewards one has earned in life.
He tried to straighten, to ease out some crick in his back, only to jerk forward once more, clutching his side with a gasp that stuttered into a rueful laugh.
When the demons finally caught me, they were keen to make up for lost time, and there is much of it down there. It was only through the ripples released across the plains when you killed Balthazar that I was able to return here at all, and they will find me again soon enough.
Fritha did not know what to say, did not even know where to begin to unravel the turmoil of anger, regret and gratitude she suddenly felt.
Saravuk, I...
A low growl that seemed to emanate from the very air about them cut her off. Saravuk raised a defiant chin to his fate.
They are coming. I do not know if we will meet again, sister, but if it could not be me who ascends, then know that, of all the others, I am proud it was you.
The rift sundered the air behind him, angry and red like a wound in the very fabric of her plane.
Saravuk.
He tried to say more, perhaps shout a final farewell as a half-dozen clawed hands snatched about him and a blood-chilling roar stole his voice.
No.
Arms were about her, both helping her to sit while preventing her from doing so too quickly, the familiar scent of cellophane confirming his presence before even sight or sound.
Fritha, calm, dearest.
They were outside, Fritha opening her eyes on the deepest night sky. No smoke obscured the cold stars, though the aroma remained, mingling with the heavy scent of blood. But what really struck her was the silence. It was not total, there were groans about her, the murmur of talk and prayers, but gone was the roar men and clash of arms. Whether they had won or lost, the fighting was over. Cellophane was stooped over her, and as she leaned up she realized they were at the aid camp in the main square. Many more bodies were laid upon the 2 rows of pallets and cots about her, Benita and the other priests scattered among them or working on the more gravely injured upon tables at the opposite end of the camp.
How is your throat?
He asked, stroking the hair back from her forehead to tidy it behind her ears. A flash of that face below her, Balthazar read with effort as he fought to loose her hands and all the while that screaming pressure against her throat.
Ah, it hurts, I suppose, nothing to worry about though. What happened here? The horsemen returned as you commanded. A no-man hung back with you while the rest of Farn's men led a charge on the enemy's exposed flanks. They had not been expecting it and took heavy losses. That combined with the blow to morale dealt when someone tossed Balthazar's lifeless corpse into their midst and they were quickly overwhelmed. We lost half our people, but we were victorious. And Jahara,
Fritha choked, more of the evening coming back to her,
and Minsk. I saw them go down. Jahara was injured, but has been discharged and is resting back at the house. Minsk.
Solophane's frown was her answer.
I am sorry, he did not make it.
Fritha eased herself back down with a sudden weariness. Part of her had known what he would say, Solophane hovering over her as though he wanted to offer some comfort, but did not know how. He was spared having to worry about it for long. Imoen had appeared and was marching down the row of cots, every inch the general in that harried but determined air.
Fritha, you're awake,
she offered by way of greeting, dropping to a crouch beside Solophane as Fritha eased herself up once more.
I was so worried when Anomen arrived with you. He told us what you did, facing Balthazar and then ordering the troops to return, and after we had agreed we had to get you out safely.
The girl vented her frustrations in a weak laugh, it was a hollow sound in the surrounding morbidity.
I guess you never were any good at taking orders. Anomen said you passed out again afterwards. Did you see something? Yes,
Fritha nodded, accepting Solophane's help to sit, her body screaming its protests.
I spoke to Saravik. There may be a way to reach the throne, but we need to get to the uppermost plane of the abyss. Across the plains,
Imoen murmured, her eyes distant.
I am sure there will be a portal somewhere in Faerun, and a mage with enough skill and the right spell could open a way there, but I only know of one place where a portal will definitely be known.
Sigil, confirmed Fritha, her gaze drawn back to tables at the opposite end where Benita battled to save the bloody body they had just stretchered in. Fritha felt the dull ache bob in her throat as the woman stepped back to bow her head over another corpse.
We can talk about this later, there are more important things right now.
The plains were aflame, the incarnadine dawn made all the more foreboding by the haze of smoke that hung over the burning grassland. It stretched east to the horizon where a nascent sun set the sky ablaze, and it was as though the whole world was on fire. People thronged about her, black-backed with faces aglow as they gathered about the bonfires. Fritha felt overlooked in the grief, sobs and murmured prayers offered to the burning pyres. The wooden paling that had once protected Al-Hali now saw its fallen safely past the veil. It seemed fitting. Once Sister Rahila had seen she was awake, she had been allowed to return to the house with the others, and there she had slept the rest of the night next to Jahara, her friends left to tend the wounded and prepare the dead. Through the silhouetted throng, Fritha spotted the priests gathered about two pyres, Benita sobbing into Sister Maganda's shoulder as they saw Audron and young Ivad across the veil. Fritha did not pause to offer her condolences, that would come later, and before then she had her own friend to guard in safe passage. She could see her companions to the east gathered about a pyre of stakes, the tang of lamp oil high notes in the redolent perfume of burning flesh. Imoen was openly weeping and it was strange seeing Anomen be the one to offer her comfort. Valigar's face set in the glow of the torch he held as he gazed down at the pyre before them. The body upon had been covered by his tattered green cloak, so only his head showed, and Minsk looked peaceful, stepped in a serenity that only a certain kind of sleep could give. His broadsword had been laid along his body, ready for his spirit to take up again on the other side. Fritha smiled, a fine sorrow welling in her chest. She could just see him storming about the eternal grasslands on the great hunt. Jahara and Solophane were in quiet conversation before her. The elf heard her approach and his arms were about her before she could offer any greeting, though there was not enough time to sink into the embrace before Imoen cut in, the girl sobbing into her shoulder.
We waited,
she sniffed as they parted.
We thought it should be you.
Fritha nodded, taking the torch Valigar passed to her. This was it, the essence was all hers now, the throne within her reach, but what a toll it had exacted. About her silence fell, and Fritha felt the words all through her chest.
Feared by your enemies, esteemed by your friends, the time has come for you to rest, Minsk of Mutern. Rejoin the spirits of your ancestors.
Her voice faltered, the tears beginning to well,
and no, we will carry the legacy of what your life earned here today, as we will take word of your sacrifice to your homeland. Kozari tell Yhild.
Those about her repeated the Rashmi blessing in a murmur lost to the roar of flames as Fritha threw the torch onto the waiting pyre. And there they remained, seated about the inferno as it threw sparks up to the pale blue sky. Fritha sang the ode of Galverk the Brave, the others joining in once she had done, to talk and tell stories of the man they had known, until the pyre no more than embers, glowing in like the low western sun. Next to Fritha, Solafane seemed to be dozing, his head resting on her shoulder and arm about her waist, though she could tell from his breathing he was not asleep. Imoen tried to hide a yawn in her sleeve. It had been a long day for all of them, and it was not over yet. The plains about Al-Hali had been clearing for the last couple of hours as pyres died and the morning returned to the shelter of the village. Fritha leaned into the warm body at her side and raised her face to take in the cloud-scattered canvas above, the vastness not as daunting as it had once been as she felt the nascent power stir through her stomach.
There are very few pyres left,
observed Valigar. Jahara shifted on the cloak she was seated upon.
The rest of you should return to Al-Hali, I will remain here and tend the ashes. I'll wait with you,
came Imoen hoarsely.
No, you more than anyone will have much to do tomorrow. Do you even know how you plan to reach Sigil?
Sighed Valigar, fingers massaging the bridge of his nose against the fatigue they all felt.
Portal summoning is not as simple as opening a door. No, but it helps when you have a key,
said Fritha, drawing from her pack the uneven stone of iridescent blue she had carried with her since Katla.
A portal stone,
exclaimed the ranger,
from where did you get that? Herr Dallas,
sighed Jahara, with a gentle smile,
he always did have a soft spot for you. Should I be jealous?
asked Solafane. Fritha shook her head.
No, he left me for an Avariel.
Poor fool, Solafane sighed, tapping her chin to raise her face for a light kiss.
So you plan to open a gate to Sigil,
Anoman forged on,
and we will all. Not all,
cut in Jahara.
My place is here. Balthazar's army was routed, but the mercenary bands will regroup, and I will not abandon the nearby villages to their mercies. I will take the remainder of our forces to disperse them, and then regroup with Farn's troops to help rout the raiders and bandits who still plague the east.
Anoman and Valigar were nodding, but Imoen looked heartbroken by the news, her puffy eyes wide.
We're splitting up again? So close to the end? Jahara is correct,
interrupted Valigar,
and I too will remain. But they're right, Imoen,
pressed Fritha gently,
there is little point saving Tether from one evil only to abandon it to another.
Imoen heaved a sigh, reluctantly leaning into the arm Jahara had just thrown about her shoulders. Fritha nodded to the man opposite.
And you, Anoman?
He smiled mildly.
My place, as ever, is with you. Then it is agreed,
announced Jahara.
Valigar and I will remain here, while the rest of you seek Melisande on the plains.
They rose as a group, Solafane falling back to allow Fritha to link arms with the dejected Imoen as they made for the village.
You should get some rest when we get back. I don't know how much the spell will take out of you, but it took 3 mages to use this thing last time.
The girl nodded once, something determined in the way she closed her hand about the gnarled blue stone Fritha proffered to her.
No problem, I'll be ready.
Imoen yawned behind her hand, her eyes watering with a grainy heat. She had seen enough dawns in the last few days to last a lifetime. Her nearby wall looked even taller from where she was knelt, and above the eastern edge a nacreous sheen pushed back the faded lavender sky, the last few stars that glittered upon it like the crystal beating on a light summer gown. Their group had gathered about a half hour ago in the yard behind the tanners, Benita and a couple of the other clerics coming out to join Jahara and Valigar in the final goodbyes. Across the square, Benita was bidding farewell to Anomen, while Jahara embraced Fritha and then, to his surprise, Solafane. Imoen smiled. She had made her goodbyes to the druid first, before her task had pulled her away, the girl returning her attention to the circles upon circles of runes she was slowly etching, ring by ring, into the packed earth. Her back was screaming by the time she had finished, 12 circles and the runes that would direct her power, the rings bisected by 2 solid lines to make a large compass, a 3-lidded eye etched into the center. Imoen eased back with a puff of satisfaction. It was entirely of her own creation, but the runes were correct and, what was more, it felt right, though she was given little more opportunity to enjoy her handiwork, a shadow over her stealing the color from the dark red earth. Valigar was wearing a look of pensive uncertainty, as though he was not sure why he was even there before her. He had been like that for days. Imoen considered he had likely been glad of the impending battle, if only for the distraction. As for her own feelings, the affection was still there, but it was buried under so much now it was hard to reach, like a smoldering flame that could be snuffed or rekindled, and take as much effort for either course. He took a step back as she straightened, dusting herself off to offer him a hand to shake.
So, Vals, this is it, then. We seem to make a habit of goodbyes, don't we? I think it's been the only constant in our relationship. Yes, I suppose that is true.
He was melancholy, his gaze shifting north, perhaps imagining the estate she never got to see. A deep sigh seemed to decide something.
Imoen, about what I said.
Don't, she cut in kindly, but firm, if it's sorry, then I know, and if it's
for the best then I understand, and if it's, soon help us, doubts, then I really can't hear them right now.
She wrestled the emotions back, finally allowing herself to gently pat his arm.
If you still want to tell me when I get back, then we can talk then.
He faltered, before nodding once and offering her a remarkably open smile.
You always were more sensible than any of us gave you credit.
Imoen laughed.
Yeah, well, I like to surprise people. We ready over there?
Called Fritha, the words coming strangled as Jahara pulled her into another embrace. For the druid at least, this would be the last chance she ever had.
As we'll ever be,
chirruped Imoen, pointing to the circle below.
There, take your positions on the compass points and put your favor hand into the center above mine. If you feel a pull, don't fight it, you go opposite me, Fritha, I might need to siphon off some of your power.
They took their places, Imoen tightening her hand about the portal stone as she raised it above the dusty, 3-ringed eye. Slowly, slowly, this isn't like tearing the veil. It was like opening a gate upon water, trying to let the energies into the stone slowly enough to be controlled, but constant enough to hold the spell. It came in fits and starts, the power building as the flow established. The air about them was buzzing, a sudden wind springing up from somewhere to howl about them, the fine dust stinging against her face. The stone in her hand was growing hotter, vibrating so violently she was fighting to keep it still. It was time.
All right, then,
Imoen yelled over the roar.
Whatever happens, we all meet in the coronet for high harvest tide. Got it? Good.
Imoen released the stone. An explosion of light engulfed the circle, and the world burnt away. End of chapter.